A new old way to think about draft strategy in fantasy football. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. And I say it like that because we're going to talk a little bit about a recent post I had called Cut Your Draft into 4 quarters or something like that. So this idea of cut your fantasy football drafts into quarters. There's always 4 quarters. Anyway, I'm Ben Gretch. You can find that newsletter there. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, as always, we're talking a little bit before the show about a variety of topics. We're talking about different players. I'm barreling in on the end of the projection section. And we should mention I got some questions about our shows. We just ended up taking last week off, some minor scheduling things, so apologies, but people they thought their feeds were broken because it's July and we skipped a week. We'll have a ton more content coming. We'll be doing some drafting bonus shows. People want bonus shows to make up for it, Shawn. So yes, we'll do all these things. I'm promising all these things I haven't even talked to Shawn about yet, but we'll have a lot of content coming. I'm very close to finishing up my projections. One of the things we will do when we get there, I haven't shared my sheet with Shawn yet. I should have, and you didn't have the time to necessarily look it over. But Shawn loves to kind of grill me on some of the projections and give me some really good feedback that then has me kind of rethinking the ways that I'm looking at it. I'm not always that concerned about the results of the projections, of course, but the research that goes into it. And anyway, there's going to be a lot of player discussion around that as well. That's coming in this show and in the future shows, up here pretty soon in the rest of July. But Shawn, we were talking about the different players and the different profiles and some of that stuff, and really talking about this range in the 3rd round, which has been something we've talked about a little bit on the show. I got a question about it recently. I think everybody is identifying the 3rd round as a tough round, and I think a lot of people are just taking their picks that they think they sort of have to move on. And there's an element of, okay, yeah, just make the pick that you need to make or whatever. But there's also a broader theory thing that comes into play, particularly around the 3rd round, which is that if there's nobody that you want there, what do you do? How do you approach it? Do you pull somebody up? Do you do, these types of things? And I think we would and will in this show make the case that you do want to pull somebody up, that you can't just take somebody that doesn't make sense at that price point. There are some guys that maybe made some sense and then they quickly rose in price. I mean, Rashee Rice was at one point going in the later 3rd round and is now like in the 2nd round in almost every format. Tyreek Hill, it's a guy that we talked about not too long ago as being maybe the right pick in that range. And now he's 2-3 turnish, pretty quickly. I think mostly because of the Jonnu trade right after that, but he rose quickly. And so it's pretty barren back there as well. You and I were just talking about Garrett Wilson a little before the show, who's somebody I've written about recently in my off-season Stealing Signals posts where I break down every team, and I went over the AFC East recently. And basically I made the case that I think, as much as I love him and I think he's going to consolidate all the volume, there's no other show in town. The rest of their receiving game is terrible. The realities of their offense, some of the specifics around them having 3 good offensive linemen, the comments they've made about Justin Fields' mobility, the fact that all 5 of their offensive linemen grade a little better in run blocking than in pass blocking, and they have a defensive head coach, and they just look like that team that's going to try to win games 17-13 all year. And even the teams that play against the Jets are probably not going to run a lot of plays. And the Jets are probably not going to run a lot of plays. And when they do, they're going to probably have a high run rate, low called pass rate. And then when they do call passes, Justin Fields, even though he's gotten better at this over the years, is still basically league worst at turning called passes into pass attempts. Last year, in a short stint with the Steelers, his scramble rates, sack rates were career lows for him, but the combination of those 2 numbers still very high, still among the league leaders there with a lot of the rookies. And we see the quarterback's numbers in this particular stat that I'm talking about, turning called passes into pass attempts, come down over time. And they've come down for Fields, but they've come down from, hey, I'm out here by myself, 10 percentage points less than everyone else, to now I'm where the rookies are, last year's rookies, which is about just under 20% of his called passes are not turning into passes because they're becoming either a sack or a scramble because he holds the ball. There's different types of quarterbacks. Some guys get rid of the ball. Anyway, I think that does have a real meaningful effect on the Jets' potential range of outcomes for pass volume, in that I don't see a lot of scenarios where it's even league average. I think the called pass rate is going to be low enough that you're talking bottom 5 pass attempts is kind of the range. Is pretty low. I mean, maybe they're 26th or 27th or something in the scenarios where they throw more than I'm expecting. That's a whole new team. Maybe they throw a lot more. Maybe I'm way off, but I think the low end of the range is also that they're 32nd and they're 50 pass attempts lower than everyone else because their called pass rate is so low and all those things. And so we were talking about that as it related to Garrett Wilson, and does he have a meaningful upside case in the third round? What do you have to get out of a third round pick? We do our shows every year, and we'll do it soon where we project next year's first and second round. And one of the big things about this article that I talked about cutting your draft into quarters and about draft strategy in general, and what we like to do is talk about who are the guys that are going to be going in the first and second round next year, who's going to have that season that means that they were the impact players for 2025, because this, concept of upside that people struggle so much to define really is the thing that defines whether or not you win in fantasy football. And so how do you get enough upside on your roster, and what is your thought process as you go through all the different rounds, and you only get so many picks? And you look at a guy like Garrett Wilson, who we love as a talent, and we think will have a 30% target share this year, and we think will be way more efficient on a yards per target basis than he's ever been, because he's had horrible QB play, and also because the fact that Fields doesn't throw the ball when the pass is a low probability pass, and he holds it and he takes a sack or a scramble, means that when he does throw the ball, you're getting just the higher percentage passes in the sample, or you're removing the lowest percentage passes out of the sample, which drives down the pass attempts, but does drive up the per target efficiency for receivers. We've seen that in old Russell Wilson offenses when Tyler Lockett would have an absurd efficiency, and different quarterbacks of this type, because they're not throwing the ball when it's probably going to be an incompletion. It's going to drive up the per target efficiency. So Garrett Wilson, I was saying to you before when I went through the projection process, his range of per target efficiency is better than anything he's had in his career. Like the low end, the stuff that he's done in the past where he's been like sub 7 yards per target at his skill level, what he does ball in hand, he's good at making guys miss. His yak is good, and his catch rate and his skills and all of those things. He's not. It would be very difficult in a Justin Fields offense for him to be as low as he's been in the past. So you just have to start there, baseline. Like, we think all that's going to be way better for Garrett Wilson in 2025 than it has been in the past, as far as like target rate and after the target efficiency. And still, what does that mean statistically? How does he hit in a way that's really meaningful? I was talking to you, DJ Moore 2023 I used as a big comparison, and in the Justin Fields offense with the Bears, he had a breakout season. His yards per target spiked. All that stuff that we just talked about. He was wide receiver 6 overall because he stayed healthy. Wide receiver 9 in points per game in PPR. I mean, just and Fields missed some time. He played some with Tyson Bagent that year and stuff, but just not enough of a hit from the fourth round in a season where he did hit for me to feel like I was wrong to not want to be drafting him that year, as much as, I've always loved that talent. And now Garrett Wilson, I was saying to you, going a round and a half higher than that. It doesn't mean that he's not going to hit. So I didn't mean to go on a whole Garrett Wilson monologue right before I even brought you in. But that's the kind of conversation we're having right now around the third round. And it's I think a starting point for the types of players that you have to consider in the different ranges and what you have to get out of them in the probabilistic range that they have. When they do hit, what does that mean? What's their floor? Sure. We think Garrett Wilson's going to score a ton of points. I would make the case that it's not going to be enough to justify some of the scenarios where maybe he doesn't actually score a ton of points.
So a lot of different questions that pop to mind as I hear you set up the frame there. And, one of those is just straightforwardly, I guess, a statement from my end to set up as well, is that we have done this third, 4-round range. And I made the case that the receivers look pretty bad. And that has a structural impact, right? When we're talking about how do you execute zero RB, for example, well, you lose any value that it has. I mean, obviously there are cases to be made that maybe it doesn't work for this format or that format, but regardless, if the receivers there are not good, then you're going to lose the value from it. I pointed out that when you look at these guys through the lens of, even just a simple projection with the RotoViz screener, those guys in sort of that wide receiver 14 range that starts with Garrett Wilson, who you're just mentioning, and finishes with DJ Moore at wide receiver 22. All of those guys look undraftable with the exception of Jackson Smith and Jigba. And even that is certainly not a home run. And it might be something where we're just kind of trying to keep the light on for a player we liked last year who hit and maybe can take another step, but there are structural reasons why the upside that you're really looking for from a pick in the middle of the third probably isn't there for him either. So one of my questions would be, how are these things looking when you go through your projections, which are obviously much more detailed and include all types, a wide range of context that a simple screener projection doesn't. Are you still seeing, or are you seeing any of this concern from a projection standpoint? I mean, these guys have to be valued in this range for some reason. But I wanted to ask you about this 4 quarters element. What are we looking for from picks in this 3-4 round range? What quarter are they in? You've mentioned to me that they're not necessarily in the first quarter. The quarters don't go evenly by rounds. So what are we looking for? And then, certainly I'm going to pitch this idea that the kind of conventional wisdom right now that you can't bring players up, that's going to hurt you because someone somewhere is going to have that player at a better price, doesn't account for the fact that this whole area could be bad. If the whole area is bad, it invalidates everything that we think about when we're talking about, getting ADP values, how you draft through there. Then we're mostly talking about redraft here, but a lot of the things would also apply to best ball. I mean, you do need to actually know how many points the players are going to score. That's pretty. And when I say how many points they're going to score, like what are the ranges and where should we actually be calibrated on as a median? Then how do you move off of that? Which players actually have tail outcomes that would be interesting, because probably not all players do. And if we're looking at a situation where rounds 5 and 6 are simply more interesting straight up, then would that not dramatically impact how you're going to draft? One of the things that I find in my own drafts right now, and when I'm looking at my exposures, I don't have as much exposure to the players in rounds 5 and 6 as I would like. The ones that I like, the exposures are too low, simply because once you get into round 5 and 6, suddenly there are a lot of options that you want to have a pretty decent exposure to. If you're playing it round by round and playing it by ADP, you could end up with teams that you actively dislike and that score fewer points.
Yeah. I mean, one thing, as you talked through that it made me think is that this is a great year to play auctions. If you've not really done a lot of auction formats, I always love the format, because when you run into these things, I don't think get captured as well as they should in an auction format. The auction prices tend to go a little bit closer to ADP than I think what everyone's seeing. And I don't think this is some kind of big shock that, we're talking about these players this way. Garrett Wilson's one that I think one of the hardest to discuss for us, that we probably would be most inclined to like in that range. And that's why I was talking about him. But I mean, there's other ones that I think are just easier to poke holes in, frankly. You mentioned it. There's just the whole range is pretty tough. And I think the market agrees with that. And I think I can say that because of how Rashee Rice and Tyreek Hill blew right through those ranges. As soon as something went a little bit more favorably, or some discussion around them went a little bit more favorably, they rose very quickly. They rose past a bunch of names that people were like, yeah, I mean, we're drafting these names here, but we don't actually really care that much about them going here. We'll go ahead and take the guy that's more exciting ahead of them. And as soon as that happens in these competitive landscapes, like the different best ball tournaments and things, you just see them get pushed up higher and higher and higher. It's like, well, I'm just going to take them a step higher than that. I'm going to take them a step higher than that. And pretty quickly their ADP just shifts meaningfully. And that's evidence, I think, that whole round is not like disliked, but is considered very flat into the round, the range behind it as well. I agree with you completely about the 5th and the 6th round and the names that are there and not being able to get enough exposure to all those names. And I'm worried about some of the guys that are now going in those rounds that I'm going to wind up not having on enough teams this year, and I'm not worried about some of the other guys. So, I mean, I do think that's really an interesting point as well. The 4 quarters thing that I wrote about, and I went to lengths, I hope the message got across, was to say that it's not novel or anything special or anything, but we've talked about different types of draft strategy and structural drafting and all these things in a lot of different ways. And just based on some questions I've gotten about different ranges and the way I was talking about different players and some of those off-season stealing signals write-ups, I was like, well, maybe the way to think about it is this, which is just restating something that we've talked about a million times. So I'm not trying to make it act like it's some exciting thing. But as you said, I'm not looking at it like it's 4 quarters of 5 rounds each or something like that. I think there's basically 4 ranges of drafts that are pretty distinct. And at first I was saying you probably should be thinking about your drafts in 2 halves. And the first half is your single digit rounds, and the second half is round 10 plus or what have you. And that's a really simplistic way to think about it. And you're like, okay, what can I accomplish in the first 9 rounds when I need to get a certain amount of wide receiver depth, probably because that's the position we know where a window really closes. In the double digit rounds, you're not going to find, people can always point to some guys who came from the double digit rounds and had some ceiling. And there are some profiles you can go after, especially rookies and young players in the later rounds that could potentially meaningfully rise big time. But when you actually think about the number of receivers that are drafted in every draft in round 10 plus and the number that hit, and you sit and look at the percentages, you don't want to be drafting wide receivers back there. It is a massive number of players that get drafted, and none of them basically do anything with real ceiling. If you go look at the point scores for the last 5 years, at the very top of the wide receiver position, almost all of them are guys that were drafted in the first single digit rounds, which is not true at any other position, frankly. So you have this, okay, we've talked about it over the years about in the first 9 or so rounds, you got to get enough wide receiver depth, and you have detours, and how do you play that? And maybe some years there's a little bit of extra wide receiver value around 10, 11, 12, so you can take a few more detours early, but you're really worried about that wide receiver window closing, etc. We talked about the running back dead zone in that secondary range. We've talked about how in the first couple rounds you have all the elite profiles, and you can take running backs. You can take anybody going in the first couple of rounds is going there because they are elite talents. There's enough of a wisdom of the crowds. There's value in fantasy drafts, but there's enough intelligence in the wisdom of the crowds of fantasy drafts that the very best players go on the top. Even the ones that, I think Saquon Barkley last year is an interesting talking point, and I brought him up when talking about the first grouping, because he's a guy that I think for a lot of fantasy analysts really digging into the numbers, he most looked like busts at the top of drafts from past years going into the year. And that's why a lot of us were talking about him with some concern. I think both you and I, Sean, definitely fell into that category. I was surprised when he started doing awesome to see how many fantasy analysts were publicly talking about they weren't as on Saquon Barkley as they should have, and sort of publicly apologize. I was like, okay, I didn't realize how much consensus there was that he was a bad pick, but he was still going there. And it got described in a lot of places as win one for the little guy or something. A lot of people that were, the reason his ADP was up there was a lot of people that were maybe not fantasy analysts or going against the opinions of analysts or what have you, were willing to say, look, Saquon Barkley is really, really good, and the Eagles offensive line is really, really good, and he's going to score a lot of points. And my argument would be that just the fact that he was going that high, the wisdom of the crowd's element of ADP is pretty interesting, in that it did reflect that he had real ceiling there, even if you took at face value that there was concern in his profile.
Does it worry you at all as it relates to the Garrett Wilson discussion, that essentially the situation with Saquon Barkley was that his rookie level, which was extraordinary, was where he actually was going into 2024? Basically Saquon Barkley beat everyone because he was an extraordinary talent, just absolutely extraordinary. And that was able to completely swamp the structural elements. One of the things I continue to point out to people is that even last year's peripherals were actually not that good. in terms of things that we tend to look at as being either predictive of something that you want to know or important context for understanding where the player's current talent level is. And then you actually have a terrible fantasy profile, right? I mean, you look at where he is, you look at where Derrick Henry is in terms of expected points, and you would say you cannot draft those guys. Now, Derrick Henry, it's a little bit of a different question because it's mostly just, are you, any given year, are you willing to draft someone whose expected point profile is below what you need at that draft slot, but you just know he's going to come out and crush from a fantasy points over expected perspective. I mean, you just basically know it, right? I mean, it's baked in. It still doesn't quite give you this 101 outcome. I mean, the problem with Derrick Henry is there's basically no path to being the 101 in terms of what you would provide in that season and how you'd be drafted the next season. One of the things that's interesting about wide receiver is there are probably even more structural things built in, which is what you referenced in the intro, that you cannot beat those structural problems in the way that a running back who can rip off all of these 60-yard touchdown runs can. But having said that, I mean, the thing that I think is so much fun about fantasy is that you can look at all of the predictive things that you want, and you should, and you need to understand all of that. But you can have a guy come out and simply be so good that it
Doesn't
defeats
matter.
all of those things. Yeah. And I mean, the thing that is weird about it, though, is that's almost always baked into the numbers because players who are that good do have the numbers already with them that suggests this is very, very possible. I mean, Barkley is
No, it's a great question, and
fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I love the way that you tied that back into Garrett Wilson, who we think is very, very good. And if this is the year where he ascends to top 5 wide receiver status, because one of the things I said about him in my Field Tippers article at the end of the season, where I break down all the pass catchers from the previous year, I called it the Target Sprout Run breakdowns or whatever in the past, was I compared him to DJ Moore. This was before I referenced when I wrote it because it was before Justin Fields was his quarterback with the Jets. But I referenced DJ Moore and how DJ Moore, year in and year out, I was saying still had a lot of meat on the bone. I still thought he was a better player than his situation and all these types of things. And I felt like Garrett Wilson was on a similar trajectory from what he's been able to do these last few years. But where I went with it in that comparison was that ultimately Moore's ceiling did never reach the very elite tier, even when we did kind of get the confirmation that he's better than what he was doing for some of those Panthers years. And people were saying he can't score touchdowns, and yeah, he can score touchdowns. Like, he's a very good player. And I was like, well, maybe that's a concern about what Garrett Wilson's inability to overcome his surroundings. Maybe that's a concern for it. But the simple response to that could just be that what if Garrett Wilson doesn't cap as a tier 2 wide receiver? What if he still has tier 1 wide receiver ceiling, which is something we believed he had from his prospect profile from year 1, from year 2? If he just has a completely different tier of ability than what DJ Moore essentially capped at, then I think it's a different discussion. And yet I do think the way that Saquon Barkley hit, and the fact that, upside over, absolutely everything is sort of the way to play. The way that Saquon Barkley hit, we have to be aware of. But
maybe the fairer way to have asked the question, or the way that would have been more directly relevant or comparative, would simply be Breece Hall has similar issues in the Jets offense, especially when they're talking up their second, third string backs, and they should. I mean, Braylon Allen getting a ton of hype. I mean, Isaiah Davis might be even better. I mean, those things are huge problems. Breece Hall looks overvalued by like almost 3 rounds. And yet Breece Hall is very similar to Saquon Barkley in that he is a potential big play machine. He's coming off of a season where the peripherals were terrible, but you look at him in college, you look at his athletic testing, you look at the big plays, even coming off of a serious injury as an NFL player. And Breece Hall, I mean, probably still is not full Saquon Barkley when both guys are at their peaks. But I mean, you're talking about a guy who was just down from that. I mean, you're talking about a guy with great vision. He's another guy who's actually a small back, just like Saquon Barkley, where he's not going to run over a bunch of people and thrash around. He's not a Marshawn Lynch, but you've got run to daylight. So you have that. So one of the things I'd like to ask you really quick here, as we go through, as it relates to this projection project that you've been doing.
Yeah.
304. Kyren Williams, projection or talent or both to get to that price?
It's got to be fully projection. He's really hard not to project for a ton of volume. Man, I don't want to lose. I love the points you were just making about Breece Hall, and I don't want to. I want to go back to that. When I wrote up the Jets in this offseason stealing signals post I referenced, I wrote, you're sort of playing this to be a Saquon talent breakout of last year. But my argument, Sean, was that Saquon was an offense expected to be very, very good. And part of my issue. So, and then another point about this was Saquon last year. One of the I think best things I wrote all of last year at the very end of August, I got questions about being too sure of Saquon's peripherals. And I wrote a piece called "You Have to Place Your Bets." And in it, I acknowledged that this really thoughtful comment I got could be right about Saquon. And the reason I think it was one of the best pieces I wrote is because I basically was like, this is all the ways I could be wrong about Saquon, and it was all the ways I was. But I was arguing that I could make a similar case for a lot of different types of things. And ultimately, it's an opportunity cost game. We have to place our bets. Who are we actually taking? We want to be taking them with, not because we're afraid to miss out, but with reason to want to bet on that. So like for the Garrett Wilson path, it's really hard for me to bet on that. When you brought up Breece Hall, the way I wrote up the Jets is that's the one I can, because I don't think there's as many structural things working.
Closer to the very elite talent at running back than Garrett Wilson is a receiver.
And that all the stuff I was saying about the run offense being built around him, I think the Breece Hall projection's meaningfully challenging because you have two good backups, and he caught 76 balls 2 years ago and 57 last year. And Justin Fields, because of those sack rates and scramble rates, is not going to get the check down to the running back on time to make those even in the range of outcomes.
Just completely shut off.
I think I left my projection feeling like 40 was doable for Breece Hall receptions, which is, I think you have to be aware that 20 is the possibility as well. But 40 is doable. 50
and they talked about him as the Jahmyr Gibbs back in their offense. But one of the things that's kind of weird about the Lions backs is that even with a Jared Goff who does not run, they do not get a lot of pass volume to the runners. Now, a little bit of that is they actually have a bunch of elite wide receivers, whereas the Jets do not. But I mean, it's massively challenging to get any volume to the backs, which is also a problem for Isaiah Davis, who probably is a plus receiving back as well.
Yeah, that's like one of his big calling cards. Exactly. So Breece, I said, if you wanted to make the Saquon argument, I think you could make it. I think that the comparison between Breece and Saquon last year, what I wrote is particularly as you move from PPR to half to some people who play non-PPR. That's where I'd be actually maybe even a little more open to going down the Breece Hall road as well. It's still applying that to Garrett Wilson is where I want to say that you have to place your bets. And as much as I love Garrett Wilson, when I look at all these situational things and the offense scoring in the bottom half, almost certainly because of a defensive-minded head coach, because of a really low win total, you made the case to me before the show that they may be better than we're expecting. And I think that's an intriguing point. But I think I would argue that if they're better than we're expecting, we're going to see the run rate. Like I think they're going to try to play all
problems way for the Eagles as well.
But they have an elite line, and they were projected to be a top 10 team in scoring, not bottom 10. So if you got to place your bets,
actually are contradictory, right? And it's one of the reasons why I have some skepticism about the way. Skepticism. I think it's important to note that, and obviously when you have an AJ Brown, a Devontae Smith, maybe a Dallas Goedert when he's healthy, those types of things. In a situation where the Jets, people are betting on the Jets to fail. But I mean, you made the case to me that their offensive line is going to be elite. If their offensive line is elite, you have a Garrett Wilson, you have a Justin Fields who's probably not. the difference between Jalen Hurts and Justin Fields is there. And I think it's meaningful, especially if you're trying to win a Super Bowl. I think when you're looking at what the numbers for the teams are going to be from a full season perspective, and even you get back to AJ Brown's comment about what the offense needs to work on being passing, that we have some similarities there that I think are being swamped by narrative or just perception of the Jets as a bad team because they've been so poorly run over the last 3 or 4 seasons.
No, I agree with that. I the one thing I have to say is I wasn't trying to make the case the Jets O-line would be elite. It's that they're better in run blocking across the board. And so if they are elite, they're probably elite as run blockers, more so maybe than pass protectors, which does, I think, really meaningfully affect the pass rate and all that stuff. But the Jets are a fascinating team. I know we're spending a ton of time on a team. People are like, I don't want to draft any of these guys anyway. But it's good that we spend time on the teams that we don't want to talk about. The other team I want to talk to you about, Shawn, is the Browns, because you've been a little more interested.
Before we get into the Browns, so let me do this kind of a rapid fire for you here. And people are going to say, well, projection talent, the talent is figured into the projection. Obviously, efficiency levels for the people you project are going to be different. We're kind of thinking of talent from the perspective of, could this guy meaningfully move in terms of where he ends up being? And is it a player where you need to have exposure to, not that it's even the Barkley season, because that's so unusual, but the types of seasons where that player, because they're so talented, hits in the kinds of range that tends to be washed out a bit by projections. So that's, why I'm saying talent projection here. Just kind of rapid fire through this round. T. Higgins at the 306. Yeah.
Let me, because I loved your point about projections and about the fact that a guy like Barkley or Garrett Wilson or Breece Hall or whoever may hit in a way that projections can't really see it. And I always make this point that when we talk about projections, and when I talk about projections, I'm talking about going through the process of researching and analyzing and reading my notes, my old notes on all these players and all this stuff to make the projection. But I almost don't care about the end result of the projection all that much. It's all about the research for me, and it's just a means to an end to some degree, where I do this really big holistic look at the team. But I do think the actual and yet I am using projection math to make the case against Garrett Wilson. And so I do think there's stuff that can come out of the projection math in terms of what it means for a range of outcomes for a situation and for what it can mean for the ways that players can hit, because we're really thinking about the ways that they can hit. That is, anyway, I kind of just wanted to clarify that. But
so I should say too that when I say projection, we're actually thinking of along multiple lines here. Where when I'm saying projection, I'm kind of thinking of the fantasy community in general, like what's propping up this price. But I also do want to be on that parallel line of finding out if your projection at all is going. So if you think that the ADP is propped up by projection, but you don't see that in yours, definitely pull that out for us as we hit through, even though, again, I want it to be rapid fire rich. T. Higgins, 306, projection
T. Higgins
or talent?
Is on one of the 5 teams that I have not yet projected.
In terms of your sense of it.
Yeah.
I mean, he scored a lot of points last year. So, I mean, the other thing too is just Blair talks about this all the time, in that we get so deep in the weeds on all of the math that people tend to forget that ADP actually is based on last year's scoring in a way that sometimes gets lost, but that's actually probably good.
Well, and I think that's
than a lot of the things that
I would make the case that ADP today is based a little bit more on where the best ball market sets it in the early offseason to a degree, because I think enough analysts are at least paying attention to that. And I think the players that are playing in the best ball market early in the offseason do skew younger, is a point that I would make. And they are a certain type of person or analyst generally. And my belief of that group is that there's more emphasis put on some of the peripherals and some of the advanced player metrics. And so I think you get the T. Higgins answer to me would be like sort of skill based. He had a very good per route profile last year. He missed a bunch of time again. And so I do think when I go through the whole projection, it's going to be hard for me to project him for enough volume behind Jamar Chase, even though this is a team that had a plus 6 or better pass rate over expected 3 years running now. We used to have the Zach Taylor thing of, will they throw enough? They're going to throw enough. I started my Bengals projection, and I have them projected for a higher pass rate by a half percentage point than the Chiefs, who are the team that last year I was talking about had the highest pass rate over expected, like 5 years running. Last year it came down a bit, and I expect them to be a little bit better in general and be in more run situation. So this is pass rate, not pass rate over expected. Their expected pass rate would be lower in a default because they're expected to win more games in a default. But I have the Bengals just slightly higher than the Chiefs for highest pass rate that I've projected through 28 teams. I just started the Bengals. I'm finishing up the AFC North. I haven't done the NFC North yet. Anyway, I do think we're going to see plenty of pass volume. I think it gets hard to see T. Higgins ceiling scenarios outside of contingent scenarios where Jamar Chase gets hurt, because I think a lot of what's pushing his profile is probably per route based stuff, per game based stuff that's not being controlled for the fact that he only played like 10 games last year, which I do think is when I talked about the whole like best ball market, I think that's a mistake that is being made in 2025 that maybe wasn't made as much with some of the research you're talking about with Blair, like 10 years ago, when it used to just be like, where did guys finish last year? Where did the points finish? T. Higgins didn't actually finish that high because he missed so much time, but because he finished high in like points per game and per route and stuff, I do think we're in a landscape where that gets overvalued in a way that people don't think about. How does that actually extend to 17 games? So anyway, that would be my answer to T. Higgins. Rapid fire.
Jackson Smith and Jigba, talent or projection? I mean, if it's talent, people have really shifted on him.
The overall,
you don't think it's projection based?
I think
where
people
they're saying there's no other receiver.
I mean, when I went through the projection process, they brought in Clint Kubiak. You tell yourself there's a pretty decent run rate. You start seeing the conversations they're having. There's a pretty decent run rate. They drafted Jalen Milroe. They're talking about they're going to have him in packages and run him like they did with young Lamar Jackson. And people are talking about Jalen Milroe is the only quarterback in the league that's faster than Lamar Jackson. And Mike McDonald was on that staff. And he's talking about we want to use Jalen Milroe as a runner. I think you're talking about Jalen Milroe just getting like more than one carry per game. I projected him for 22 rushes. So getting some rushing work over the course of the year that also shifts your run rate, because it's like we're putting him in for a run package. So I don't know. It's hard for me to go through a projection.
So Ben's like, you shouldn't be picking Jackson Smith and Jigba at this range. It's not based on talent or projection. It's a weird price. That is sad. I don't completely disagree. Devontae Adams, 309, talent projection.
I think that's projection. I think that's people saying Sean McVay's offenses do this. Matthew Stafford does this, and not looking at the fact that Devontae Adams' peripherals were still good last year, but fell pretty meaningfully. I don't think it's a talent-based thing. I think I don't want to miss out on what Matthew Stafford's done for wide receivers in the past and Sean McVay's done in concentrating volume in the past.
Marvin Harrison. So we skip over the QBs, which is kind of a different conversation. Marvin Harrison at 312. Projection talent.
That must be talent. I mean, there's a thing to be said in a projection that, like, behind Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison, there's nothing. It's Michael Wilson, who's a rotational deep threat. It's Greg Dortch again and Zay Jones, and that's it. I mean, there's not – the targets can really consolidate in a projection, but it must be a profile. Like, I don't know if talent's the right word, but a profile-based thing, right?
James Cook at the 401. Projection or talent?
That's a good question. I don't know. I guess projection. You got to put the touchdown somewhere. You and I talked about it before the show, but the only Bills who had more than 6 touchdowns last year were James Cook and Josh Allen, and they had 62. They were tied for the second most offensive touchdowns in the NFL, and they had 2 dudes with more than 6. Ray Davis was third on their team in touchdowns. He's a backup running back who didn't even seem to have like that big of a year. Ty Johnson scored some TDs behind him. Mac Hollins was the number 1 wide receiver or tight end in touchdowns with 5. Khalil Shakir was in a tie with 4 for the rest of the team. I do think the James Cook spike in rushing TDs to 16 TDs is something that when you go through a projection, you say, okay, when they switched to Joe Brady as the offensive coordinator, they started running for a lot more TDs. They led the league in rushing touchdowns over both the Eagles and the Lions by 3 and the rest of the league by 7. They had 32 rush TDs last year. That surprised me. That's one of the stats that when I went through their projection, I was like, they had more rushing TDs than the Lions and the Eagles last year by 3 and 7 more than the rest of the league. And they had more rushing TDs and passing TDs. When just go back to 2022, they were a 35 pass TD, 15 rush TD team. Years prior to that, 36-20, 40-16. I mean, they have double the pass TDs as rush TDs in that stretch. It was a little closer in 2023, which is the year that Joe Brady took over. In the second half of the year, Josh Allen started rushing for a bunch of touchdowns down the stretch. That carried over to last year where they had more rush TDs than pass TDs. And I think that's why you look at James Cook in a projection and you go, he probably has to keep that really high rush TD rate. It's probably like a projection-based thing, I think, Sean.
It's an interesting one because that looks like a dynamic where when you're in the midst of it, especially on a potent team like the Bills, those touchdowns feel inevitable. As soon as they stop, then just everyone, and not to say anyone's right or wrong on this, but just the entire community goes back to this idea of, well, obviously that was not sustainable, and we shouldn't have been thinking about it from the perspective of it being sustainable. It's a tricky one there. James Cook, another one of these running backs who had massive efficiency numbers last year. Kenneth Walker, the 403. This would be one I almost ask you from the opposite direction, where like not what's propping his
holding
price
him
up
down
in round 3, but
Yeah.
like why is he not higher? Is it talent or projection? And then, I mean,
Well,
drafters are betting on his backup, so that seems
Yeah, I don't even
somewhat
really want
straightforward.
to talk about him that much, but it seems we can't really change his ADP because we've been talking about him a lot. I mean, he's the next guy that obviously should be just shooting through the third round and going to the top of the third round, both from a talent and a projection standpoint. His missed tackle for stuff, all of that stuff was absurd last year. He had really the lowest rate of yards before contact. Some of that's because he runs laterally, but you change the whole rushing attack around to specifically, you want to talk about the Saquon Barkley of this year. This is him. They designed the entire rushing offense around being able to get him yards before contact, so that massive missed tackle forced ability is now in the second level, and you get the home run runs. And I actually think that's going to happen. I mean, I think you really have to be on Kenneth Walker at this price. I have no idea why he goes as late as he does. They've talked in the offseason about they need to run more in the red zone. This is another team where you might see that kind of shift with an offensive coordinator shift that I just described with the Bills, where they're suddenly scoring a higher rate of their touchdowns on the ground. This is they love Kenneth Walker. They've talked about his profile and being very favorable about him. Zach Charbonnet has good numbers too. He's a good backup, and Kenny McIntosh was legit interesting as a year 1 guy as their RB3 last year. I think it's a really good backfield, and I think they're going to build the team around that. But Kenneth Walker is going to get what he can. I mean, their O-line is maybe not great, but it's been overhauled. They brought in a new first-round rookie guard. They have like guys that were on the roster last year. They're going to play this year that didn't necessarily play a ton. I mean, they're going to do a zone rush scheme and a new offensive coordinator. They're going to try different things. And I'm not like optimistic about the O-line, but the whole point is to try to like make this a rushing forward attack, and then they're not going to just like have Sam Darnold drop back and throw to win. Like they're going to throw off the run. That's what Clint Kubiak tried to do with the Saints last year. That's what all the Kubiak Shanahan schemes are based around. That's what McDonald wanted from Grubb and why he fired him after 1 year, even though this offense didn't bottom out. It wasn't bottom of the league. They fired Grubb because he didn't run the ball enough. That's very clear. That's like well documented. That's been written about in the Seattle media a bunch. He called too many pass plays, straight up. They went and got a coordinator that will call more run plays. Like the whole thing is,
we're going to go back in time and have Colin cut that, because again, we haven't been able to move Kenneth Walker so far, but we don't want to either. Harry McLaurin, the 404. Is he being propped up here by talent or the projection?
Yeah, I guess I don't know how to say this one either. It must be a little bit projection based because I don't think it's like the talent. I mean, he had a massive TD rate last year, and it's one of those things where my issue with McLaurin when I went through the projection is it felt like double counting to me, where people are saying he's the number one for Jaden Daniels, and there's not a ton of competition. Deebo Samuel might be too old or whatever. We already had Daniels playing at a really, really high level last year, and he already had no target competition last year. And his targets per route were not any better than they've been, which is not bad, but not elite. and he didn't get any of the quick hit stuff. He did actually have a long touchdown off a quick hit in that Lions game in the postseason. But for the most part, they're throwing these RPOs to like Olamide Zaccheaus, and then they brought in Debo and drafted Jalen Lane, who's a ball and hand guy who has really good punt and kick return skills and rushing numbers and all this stuff. Like if Debo's bad, Jalen Lane's a late round sleeper because he's going to be the dude that would then take what I think Debo's going to get, which is the Olamide Zaccheaus stuff last year. I've talked about the RPO offenses consolidating on number one targets. That doesn't happen here. It's not going to consolidate on Terry McLaurin because he's not their ball and hand guy on the short RPO passing stuff. He's their vertical threat, but they're number one. And so he's not their short area target. He might get a few gimme targets like he did in the postseason. So anyway, his targets per out can't get massive because he's at a high ADOT. He's going to get a lot of air yards, and he's going to be efficient. We already saw that last year with the really high, like elite receiving TD rate. And he wasn't a top, like, I don't know exactly where he finished, but he finished with a 1.98 yards per out run. His career high is only 2.05. He's consistently very good, but this is not like amazing. He had 1,098 yards. Here it is. He was wide receiver 16 in points per game last year with 13 touchdowns, second in the NFL in touchdowns. But he didn't even have 1,100 yards in a year where he did have a very good year. He's going wide receiver 18 this year when he was wide receiver 16 in points per game with 13 TDs last year. I guess I don't know why he's going there for projection or talent. Like what is he that makes this make sense? How much better does Jay Daniels have to be than he was last year for Terry McLaurin? He's got more competition this year, Sean.
So we have Kamara next. We know that is a check down projection-based play. What about, so we'll skip Hampton, obviously a rookie there, and we think that he's at least a little bit undervalued. Mike Evans, middle of round 4, the 1,000 yard streak. You have Godwin theoretically back and healthy at some point, if not maybe exactly week 1. You have the drafting of Ibuka. You have Jalen McMillan. Is this projection because the Bucs are going to lead the NFL in passing, or are people saying that this version of Mike Evans you still can't pass on at this price?
I think that's what it is. It's like we have to just respect that Mike Evans has done this every year forever, and this is his talent level, and you can't let Mike Evans fall any further because if you die under the projection, like they were good in 2023, and that got Dave Canales a head coaching job. They had 36 offensive touchdowns that year. It was considered an achievement because like before the season, they didn't even know Baker Mayfield would be their starter, and he has a great year. They jumped from 36 to 57 under Liam Cohen last year. Baker Mayfield's pass TD rate was good at 5.3%. It jumped to 7.3% or something in those ranges. It was the low 5s, and then it jumped to the 7s. It's like he's not going to it's just, you always want to fade in fantasy the mostly pocket passer who had the pass TD rate spike the year prior. That's what we're looking for with our late round pocket passers is that they stack a bunch of passing touchdowns, especially if you got Liam Cohen no longer there. Because I think part of that is, interestingly, Baker's passing ADOT came way down, but like they were really efficient in the red zone. And I think Liam Cohen actually is a really good play designer in the red zone at getting like easy catches. I talked about this in Stealing Signals last year, but Rachaad White had a bunch of receiving TDs where he was just left alone. Whatever they were doing with the receiver routes down the field and all that stuff was taking so much attention away that he was able to just catch a ball in the flat and run like 10 yards for a 10-yard receiving TD completely untouched. He tied for the most receiving TDs in the NFL with Devon Achane with 6 last year in a year where he was considered basically a bust because Bucky Irving took over his role. But those are mostly just like walk-in touchdowns for him in the passing game. They had some other, short passing TDs. They had some explosive downfield passing TDs. One of Godwin's long TDs was on a pump fake, quick screen leak up the sideline where Godwin's wide open and he catches him. It's like one of the only, he had a career low ADOT. One of the only like downfield targets he got was a design downfield target on a pump and leak play. And he has a long touchdown up the sideline on that. Jalen McMillan had some vertical TDs. Whatever they were doing, from a play calling standpoint, it's one of the reasons I'm really excited about what he could do for Trevor Lawrence because I think he's the perfect fit. Lawrence has needed his ADOT to come down and to find some easier throws underneath in the red zone, like the exact things that Trevor Lawrence needs for his profile to be meaningfully better for the Jaguars and for fantasy football is a passing TD spike and not pushing the ball into coverage in the red zone, and that's all the stuff that Liam Cohen had a really positive impact on Baker from one year to the next. that they're like the guy that's their new coordinator was on staff last year, and him and Todd Bowles are preaching continuity. They're going to try to do all that same stuff. But I do think it's tough when you lose sort of the designer of the offense and the changes that they made in 2024 that were so positive for this offense. So you go through the projection, you're like, this is Baker Mayfield's the most overvalued quarterback in all of fantasy by a mile. I mean, his past TD rate's got to come back. And on the rushing side, he scrambled a bit more last year, and it was new. It was more than double his previous career high for rushing yards, and it was only his second season with multiple rush TDs. He had 3 rushing TDs. So you got some meaningful rushing value out of him. Maybe he'll continue to scramble this year. Maybe that's something that he's gotten more comfortable with over the years. I don't know. But you got meaningful rushing value out of him that he had never shown you at any other point in his career. In the same year where his past TD rate went 2 percentage points higher than what I think was his prior career high in 2023. Like he threw for 40 touchdowns. That number is just not going to get matched. The team overall is going to score less points. They have a lot of great receivers. They still have a great offensive line, although the Tristan Wirfs thing is a concern. He's going to miss the start of the year now after they did a knee scope. There was more damage than expected. He's their all-world left tackle, very meaningful to their passing game. And then I think, they reinforced their passing game with Ibuka, but I wrote it as they reinforced it more than they made it better because you are dealing with Godwin coming off injury and Evans being a year older. I think it makes it that it ensures the wide receiver position is still a strong position for them, but I don't know that they're like definitely going to get better play out of their wide receiver position if Godwin and Evans aren't both playing 17 games, which is kind of what I would expect, I guess. And so it's from a projection standpoint, you get through the whole offense and you're like, I don't love it. And people are really high on Bucky Irving, who's going super, super high. And I obviously love the talent. We've talked about there being a little bit of concern there just from the perspective that he's probably not like an elite top 5 overall athlete at the position. And it makes it tricky, especially if the offense is moving back. But if you think he's going to have a second round production profile, you're definitely not thinking that Baker Mayfield's going to do all the stuff that I was just talking about as a quarterback. And then that also, it's going to negatively impact Evans when you start to do a projection and you try to factor in a first round receiver and, the fact that they throw to the running backs a good amount, Baker throws to the running backs a good amount, all these things. Like I couldn't project these guys for the target shares I wanted to across the board. I have Evans lower than I'd want him to, but I also have Godwin lower than I'd want him to. And I have Ibuka lower than I would ever project a first round wide receiver in targets in a vacuum. So anyway, it has to be a talent-based thing on Evans. It has to be that people are just like, Evans is going to find a way to get there. He's going to score a bunch of touchdowns. And maybe he will. He's really good.
All 3 of the big names in the Bucs passing offense are quite difficult at their price. One of them does seem like they will hit, but
that's what I did too. I got through the projection and I'm like, I'm saying that I don't want to play anyone on the Bucs, but I do think they're going to score points. Someone's going to be.
Usually it's a case where, and again, not that you're always right, but that it definitely seems like lean talent, lean the most expensive, who, even though he's the most expensive, is pushed down by the target competition, or lean inexpensive, the player who either could break out or simply that because of their price, the target competition doesn't matter as much.
Which is Bucky and Ibuka, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It got me a little more into like, if I want to play this offense, maybe I should be taking some stabs at Ibuka.
Or again, I think that you have to respect the reporting from camp and all of the camps. And we're about to get a ton more reporting once training camp starts. I think that you can't ignore it completely. You've got to respect it. I do just always go back to the thing with Ibuka where these things that they are talking about from the Bucs practices that have happened so far do not show up in the numbers for him. Even, at Ohio State, even though the Ohio State people also loved him. So I'm very open to being wrong on him. I do think it's a weird one where you just really would like to see some of that in the profile. So then these last kind of 2 guys here, we'll skip Chuba at the 410, but these last 2 receivers are in some ways kind of weird in that you have similarities. DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, both guys who are talented, but probably not at that first round level. So even when they have contextual problems, it's not like it's just that is pushing them down. But you could also make the case that they're actually pushed up by this perception that they are good, and that if they weren't limited by QB play and whatnot, that they would be doing better. But the big difference there is that DJ Moore potentially has a ton of competition, whereas DK Metcalf has none. Is this talent? Is it progression? Is it projection? And I guess then the secondary question on Metcalf and only being the one spot ahead of Moore is that does pass volume completely
Yeah.
neutralize what should be target share or what you're going to get from target share?
And I mean, it's another one of those ones where when I go through the projections, there's certain situations that I'm like, this is outlier in terms of what it means for the entire range of outcomes. And like, that's what I was talking about with the Garrett Wilson stuff. It's like, I don't want to be too influenced by my projection research as if like I can see the future, because we know that team situations are often different than what is projected. And so you take in what's helpful from the projection, and then you want to not be too strongly tied to like, oh, I think this is the way that things have to split out. But in certain scenarios with like the Jet situation, I talked through all the things. It's like everything's pointing in a way that does make me feel pretty confidently this is an outlier situation in terms of the range of outcomes for the pass volume. And that's the same deal with the Steelers, where I get through the projection and I'm basically like, even at a cheaper price, I don't see a lot of scenarios where there's ceiling here. I mean, there's the potential for touchdowns. Like Aaron Rodgers could potentially give you a good TD rate, but especially now that they brought in Jonnu Smith, like they're going to use both the tight ends in the pass game, right? They're going to use both Freiermuth and Jonnu. They're talking a lot positively about Freiermuth. And Jonnu Smith's price hasn't really fallen. I don't know what people are really expecting there. He had like 70 target. Like people are like, he was really good with Arthur Smith. I mean, not really. Like he was with Arthur Smith in Tennessee early in his career, and he had some interesting stuff at times, but not anything like where his price is in fantasy. In Atlanta, he had career highs that he then meaningfully bested in Miami in a completely sort of different role that he's not going to have in an Arthur Smith offense. And the Atlanta role, he had like 70 targets and was good. Kyle Pitts had 90 targets in that offense. Like it was, I mean, whatever. Kyle Pitts maybe not considered a certain type of tight end, but I don't think they brought in Jonnu Smith to take over Pat Freiermuth's role. I ended up projecting him for the same number of targets, but in part because Jonnu Smith's ADP is still quite a bit higher. If I was just doing this like agnostic and I was trying to be accurate, I think I would project Freiermuth to actually play more and have more targets. I think they brought in Jonnu Smith to be sort of like he was with the Falcons. They're sort of like tight end 2 and situational threat, a weapon, of sorts, but that Freiermuth's going to be like their 3-down tight end. And then Jonnu's going to be sort of this 2 tight end guy, but they'll also call plays for their 3rd tight end, Darnell Washington, who Arthur Smith loves. And all of Arthur Smith's offense have more targets to the tight end 3 and tight end 4 than you could ever consider. In addition to the fact that this is a team that you're talking about a negative pass rate over expected. They were solidly negative under Arthur Smith last year. Arthur Smith's always been solidly negative. He calls run plays. They drafted a day 2 running back to pair with Jaylen Warren, and they've talked about him as a volume runner. Arthur Smith has cited his yards per carry in the 4th down. He gets better as the game goes along. We got to make sure he gets enough carries. They're going to run the ball. And then you have pace, which at least last year they did play with some pace. They were run heavy, but they played with a little bit of pace. They got somewhat interesting at times. And so now, and Arthur Smith seems to kind of like that, but now you're bringing in Aaron Rodgers, whose like entire thing is he took so much time at the line last year, Sean, that he took multiple delay of games in situations where he was just standing there changing the play until the play clock ran out. And like, he obviously thinks
Aaron Rodgers and Phillip Rivers are the 2 guys who were like what the baseball rules had to be changed for, where, if there was no one out there officiating, their games would take 5 hours because they would just never hike the ball.
Yeah, snap the ball. So anyway, this is a team that you're going to have a slow pace and a run lean, and both of those things are not good for the potential range of pass volume. I do think Rodgers could potentially be more efficient as a passer, working off of a good run game, and I do think at times Rodgers is just going to, like, from a personality standpoint, be like, I want to throw a lot of passes and kind of win that argument over Arthur Smith, although, I mean, it'll be fascinating to see how that all goes together. I don't know what people want from Metcalf because his profile is sort of more vertical, and he's probably not like a target dominant number one that runs all the different routes. And when they do throw more, they'll probably be throwing to these tight ends and stuff, and some of the other receivers potentially, and Metcalf. I mean, Metcalf's going to have the top target share on the team. I'm projecting him for 50 more targets than anyone else, but I got him at like 120, which is not like a massive number for a number one receiver, and puts him a lot lower in my projections than this range that you're talking about. There's many guys going behind this range that we talk about liking that my projection came out better. Maybe I'm just way too optimistic on Jerry Jeudy and Chris Olave and some of these dudes, but I mean those guys are going to get a lot more targets than DK Metcalf. And yeah, their quarterbacks are bad, but like a lot of targets matters. So anyway, the DJ Moore one I would be more open to, but he's in the NFC North. He's one of the few teams I have not projected yet. You made a comment to me. You think they may pass a lot. It stuck with me, and I do think I'm going to project them for a pretty aggressive pass rate. I think that's right because the way that they've approached the running back position, people are starting to get really excited about DeAndre Swift. His price is really rising and stuff, and they're starting to tell themselves Ben Johnson really does like him. I guess I want to play that through Roschon Johnson because I think he's probably going to be like the David Montgomery. Like he's a bigger back, and DeAndre Swift's not your between the tackles guy. Roschon Johnson's underpriced. Like that dude's going to come out and run the ball a decent amount, but probably they're just going to be pass heavy, right? I mean, their 7th round rookie Kyle Monangai is not a very intriguing prospect. I don't know. You would know better than me, but
Doesn't seem to be. But he's the guy that I've moved into the draftable range now simply because I don't want to be overconfident on Swift and Johnson, but we do have a decent amount of information on those two guys to suggest that if there's another interesting player, at some point the coaching staff is going to lean that direction because Swift and Johnson just are not very good.
Right. That's why the only reason I'm in on Johnson is the price point as opposed to Swift, where you have to pay like you have to pay a quarter two price. We were going to talk about the draft quarters, and I was taking too long explaining the concept, Sean, but the quarters for people who want the Cliff Notes was that the first 2 to 3 rounds is the first quarter. All those players are really good. You got to hit in those ranges to win your league. I mean, it's just sort of a result. And if you don't hit, it's mostly just bad luck. I think it's the least important, like interesting range, even though those are the players that we spend the most time talking about because they're all really good profiles. There's a lot of overlap in their ranges. Situation often dictates whether they can produce at a ceiling. The second quarter is like the round 3 range to like round 8. And that's like the most important range of drafts. And the point that I made to you before the show and I made in the article is in that range, you got to get guys that we always talk about next year's first and second round. You got to get guys that score like quarter 1 players because the team that wins your league is going to have like 5 quarter 1 players because there's going to be some teams that have 0 quarter 1 players. Even though you only get 2 or 3 picks in the the really high leverage rounds, you got to get other guys that score like that. And so you do have to be willing to lean into the types of profiles that can score like that in that quarter 2 range and not just try to find these high floor guys, which is the big mistake that people make, especially with like dead zone type backs. Like, he's going to get a lot of volume, but like he can't score like a quarter 1 guy. And then you have the quarter 3 is more like round 8 to round 12, which is even a smaller window than quarter 2, but it's where you start to get into the 0 RB candidates. You get into the QB window that we talk about. Wide receiver has already probably dried up. I mean, you probably better have addressed wide receiver to a certain degree by that point. To some degree, you can find guys in this sort of quarter 3 range that can replace some of the quarter 2 production if you are seeking like real upside, but that doesn't hit out of quarter 2 and maybe a floor hits. But I basically have described quarter 3 as like a replacement level. Like you can cut these guys as well. And the quarter 4 is just like pure flyers, round 12 on. You're not really expecting to be able to get something like quarter 1 production out of the very late rounds either. But if you are, you're probably going to get it from running back. It's probably going to be Bucky Irving last year. That's the one position that you can draft a guy in the 15th round and he can be a second rounder the next year. Anyway, that was the thing we were talking about, and we've layered those concepts in throughout. You've been asking me a bunch of these questions about the 3rd round, the 4th round, this quarter 2 range. The way I would describe it is a lot of these guys in this quarter 2 range don't have quarter 1 scoring potential. DK Metcalf does not. DJ Moore might, I guess. I haven't done that projection yet. I'm curious where I'll land. There's a lot of competition, as you said, but I'm I'm curious what I'll find myself landing at in terms of play volume and pass rate. And Adunze, we talked about how he had a really bad catchable target rate last year. And you and I spent some time watching some of those targets, and it was just really bad. Caleb Williams struggled. But there's still reason to be mildly concerned about Adunze going forward. They add Burden, they add Loveland. I still think TJ Moore's probably pretty clearly the number one. And if he can really consolidate in a higher volume offense, seems possible that he could be a meaningful play in that range. But it's I'd probably just rather play it through the cheaper options. I don't know. What do you think about that? The Bears. You've given it more thought.
It can't be lost on Ben Johnson that the offense was so much more dynamic last year when David Montgomery was out. And so even if you do want to be explosive in the running game and force defenses to account for it, you also need to score points. And the Bears simply will not be as good as the Lions, which means you need to throw more to overcome that fact as well. If they don't pass a lot, it means that the receiving weapons, I mean, they were not that happy with Moore. They've talked to him about that. He's promised to kind of change his ways, have a better attitude, which should be easy in a more well-run offense and better run team. Adunze, a huge question mark, still I think has big upside, but he also now has massive bust potential. One of the things that we know about these early drafted rookie receivers is that the early production can even mask just how bad they are because there's so much incentive for teams to get the ball to a Marvin Harrison and a Rome Odunze. And when those things don't materialize, it's certainly not because the team wasn't trying to push it in that direction. So it raises a little bit more of a red flag almost than players who were drafted slightly later. Luther Burden, massive upside, also could be just a very limited type of, I mean, you even have scouts who think that Burden actually can do everything and is going to be a star. I'm pretty open to that. One of the reasons why I'm skeptical about both Moore and Odunze is that Burden has the potential to step on them in a way that I don't think is priced in, even though there's some skepticism of both Moore and Odunze priced in. And Burden
Did
has
he
to come
step
back
on
healthy.
DeAndre Swift? The way that like Marvin Mims started getting a lot of passes out of the backfield last year. Could he also be Ben Johnson's Jahmyr Gibbs in some ways?
Well, we need a little bit of that if we're going to be out on Swift, because otherwise just pure is going to take him to a place where you're pretty disappointed that you don't have any exposure. I mean, Swift is one of those guys where I think, I mean, he beats ADP based on volume, and yet at the end, even though everybody's like, well, you should have drafted him, you're like, but he wasn't a big win, so why should we have drafted him? We had other options that were good there. It's a tough conversation because exactly what you want to attack tactically can be different, right? And again, that's one of the reasons why I think people should read your 4 quarters article, so that even if they disagree with parts of it, they are intentional in how they are building their tactics, know what they're trying to accomplish, know what the opportunity costs are, what you're losing, what the trade-offs are when you go in a direction of taking someone like a Swift. And then you have the 2 tight ends. And I don't know that we're going to get great information on where Loveland is health-wise until we get into camp and see all those things. If he's healthy, he's going to be an issue. Cole Kmet could still be an issue. It gets tough because you'd have to have either a gigantic step forward from Caleb Williams, which again, I mean, the Williams thing is tough too. There's a very real, just complete bust risk with him now.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you get to where there are so many ifs involved, then you don't want to be off of that scenario where these guys are basically what they were in college, which is stars. It wouldn't take that much for things to click into place and have them do that. But the chain of events does have more pieces now that have to go right. So you also want to be aware as you're pricing things of all these scenarios where just none of these guys are even startable. You're looking at them on your bench all season, which is one of the reasons why we talked about this issue with the Bucks and how do you work through that. I mean, Luther Burden now is so inexpensive because of the injury he suffered that kept him out of the minicamp stuff and was so high profile because of his draft slide, the things about work ethic Now you miss that. I mean, he's one of these guys where it's not surprising, but that he would slide. The concerns are real. I don't want to ignore the concerns, right? You have a very legitimate chance of getting basically a 0 from Luther Burden, but the price is different enough and it falls into a very weird range where you're like, Luther Burden is multiple rounds below where you should stop taking wide receivers. So if you have a guy who's a legitimate target there, even if it's purely contingent and somewhat low probability, what that player can give you is so meaningful from the price that is
Yeah.
kind of the way you have to consider playing that team, even in, and especially you want to go in eyes wide open and know what the problems are. But if you do that and it fits with your build, I mean, again, that one just seems very, very
It's
straightforward.
very similar.
Almost even if you're a Burden skeptic, it's pretty straightforward.
It's straightforward. Yeah. It's very similar to you were saying last year, what you could get from like the Jordan Addison fall, because people were worried about the suspension and stuff, and Jameson Williams. And it was like, well, I mean, suddenly we can get some of these profiles that you're like, I mean, now we can take more running backs early and potentially build some really interesting teams. And those are the teams that we built that crushed, that won their leagues and did really, really well. If you can get that type of wide receiver profile when the wide receiver window is supposed to be closed, and you're supposed to be into the veterans with no ceiling and no potential real breakout potential to make a meaningful impact on your starting lineup. And it's, the Christian Kirks and stuff that I've tried to talk myself into a little bit at times. It's very straightforward to your point. I mean, if Burden does hit in the ways that you're talking about from that price point, it's sort of a no-brainer that he would be a super valuable player. But yeah, we're going to have a lot more projections-based discussion. And I say projections-based, but it's really just like me and Shawn sharing notes on our deep analysis. Like, again, the reason I'm not done with my projections in the middle of July is I just use it as an opportunity to do like 2.5 to 3 hours of analysis on all 32 teams. And it's a lot of, I can only do like 2 teams in a day because it's a lot of thinking about the teams, and I'll finish the projection and then need to come back and make a change. When we talk about the Browns, which we will talk about, I was mildly curious about Deontay Johnson. And then like I came back later and I was like, no, I have him for too much. I mean, he's always earned volume per route, but there's this talk that he's going to play in the slot, which he's never done. And they are going to play Cedric Tillman. I mean, Tillman got hurt right after they traded Amari Cooper to open up Cedric Tillman. He started running a bunch of routes. Then Tillman gets hurt and misses basically the rest of the year. They're going to play Judy on the outside. And then the Harold Fannin discussion that we've had. You talked to me about how you think Fannin might step on Njoku a little. I think Njoku's pretty intriguing. We're going to talk about the Browns when we get a chance on a different show. I got to run to a different recording with Leone, another projections pod. But you and I will be back, and the Browns are top of the list that we'll talk about. But Fannin's going to run some of those slot routes, and I just don't think it's going to. So Johnson's probably not going to run as many routes as. He's probably not going to make the team. But if he does make the team, he's probably not going to get enough opportunity, enough routes, and all those things. But that was an example of I get down to the projection, I come back, and I go, well, didn't really think through how all the routes are going to split from the outside to the slot and how that fits with Fannin, and do my target shares, So anyway, people ask, how are you not done with your projections? And I mean, there's a lot of really good analysts out there that I'm not going to say they did anything wrong by being done with their projections, but I could do bad projections and be done. And I'm not saying that anyone else is doing that, but I'm saying that for me, the point is very thorough. Hopefully on this show, when I talk through some of the teams and some of the trends I talked about, it validates that I take a lot of time to go through these teams when I build these. So anyway, almost done. We'll have them full projections released at Stealing Signals in the next week or two.
So make sure to check that out. Make sure to check out Ben's piece on the 4 quarters drafting. Again, bengretch.substack.com. Have a flurry of articles coming at RotoViz. We'd love to have you guys over there. RV Radio 2025 for a 10% off your 1-year sub. This has been a lot of fun. As always, we love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.